Hi, and welcome to the show. Rate and review at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today on the show, we have Jim Geraghty. He's a healthcare executive. He's the author of the book, Inside the Orphan Drug Revolution, The Promise of Patient-Centered Biotechnology. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we'll talk about your book in a little bit, but first off, just briefly share your story and journey to where you are today.
Sure, thank you. So I started in the orphan drug world actually 40 years ago, at just about the same time that the Orphan Drug Act was passed and helped trigger the Orphan Drug Revolution. I started working as a consultant in companies helping to develop safer therapies for hemophilia around the time of the tainted blood scandal when HIV had devastated the hemophilia community, and I was inspired by the power of what effective therapies could do.
Wonderful. So before getting into your book, and let's get everyone on the same page, what is an orphan drug?
An orphan drug is a drug for an orphan disease, and an orphan disease would colloquially just be called a rare disease. It's technically defined in the Orphan Drug Act as a disease in the United States that afflicts fewer than 200,000 people, which is less than 0.5% of the population. Similar definitions in other countries.
All right. And in terms of, what are some examples of orphan drugs? So my clinician audience would get a sense of what we're talking about.
There's a small number of genetic diseases that are well known. They are orphan, but they're widely enough known that most people know them, or most of your physicians would know them well. Those include the diseases like hemophilia, muscular dystrophy, the various forms of muscular dystrophy, Duchenne's and others, cystic fibrosis, the most prevalent monogenic disease in Caucasian populations, sickle cell disease, the most prevalent monogenic disease in African American populations. But there are 7,000 identified monogenic diseases, and one of the reasons it's a pleasure to have a chance to talk with your audience is most physicians, when they go through medical school, never hear about most of them, right? They're kind of an alphabet soup of, metachromatic leukodystrophy and adrenal leukodystrophy and so many others that people don't know, or they're named after obscure 19th century European discoverers like Gaucher disease, Fabry disease, Pompe disease, and many even rarer than those.
All right. And you wrote about this in your book, of course, Inside the Orphan Drug Revolution, The Promise of Patient-Centered Biotechnology. So tell us some of the major issues that face orphan drugs today. Like, why is it such that you need to write a book about it? What are the major challenges that this industry faces?
Collectively, these 7,000 diseases are estimated to afflict almost 30 million Americans, almost 10% of the American population, but most of them go undiagnosed for many years because physicians are not aware of them, don't recognize the symptoms. Patients are regularly misdiagnosed for many years, mistreated. And the true tragedy, Kevin, is for many, if not most of these diseases, they have an onset at birth or in infancy, and they are rapidly progressive. And if identified and treated at birth or soon afterwards, today with therapies that are available, patients can live normal, healthy lives. But if left untreated for even a few years, they progress irreversibly, both physically and neurologically, in ways that are tragically irreparable. So the more we know about early diagnosis, newborn screening is a major priority. The more we're able to develop to bring these therapies to people. And then the second issue, which we'll come back to in a moment, I'm sure, is the challenges of developing new therapies, which is really what's on the future horizon.
Sure. So before moving on, just to illustrate a point, tell us a story or a case study that would really bring that point that you just said to light.
Well, I'll give you an example. It's a live example today in a company I'm involved with. The disease is metachromatic leukodystrophy, or MLD. And there's a therapy for that disease called Libmeldy that's approved in Europe, was approved by the European Medicines Authority now, I would say maybe 2+ years ago. Still not approved by the FDA because the regulatory bars are so high and so complex. And sadly, there are children being born with metachromatic leukodystrophy in the United States today who, first of all, are not diagnosed because we don't have newborn screening available in the states in which they live. And secondly, do not have access to the therapy that's available in Europe. Those children, if treated at birth, could be playing, soccer as children. Untreated at birth, they'll be wheelchair bound and incapacitated for life.
And just give us a sense in terms of the bar that the FDA sets, like contrast that to that in Europe. Like, what are the major differences in that bar being so high?
They're very complex matters. The bar is high, appropriately high in both jurisdictions, as it should be. The issue is that we need regulatory flexibility to recognize that in these orphan, or as we often call them, ultra orphan, in the case of these very rare diseases, some of the standards around what's called in the regulatory world CMC, the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, the manufacturing side of drugs. There are traditional requirements around things like process validation and lot comparability, which when you're only treating a handful of patients are extremely difficult to demonstrate. Mm-hmm. And so what we need is much more flexible use of what's called accelerated approval, where drugs are approved for these chronic, devastating diseases with very safe therapies. And then over a period of years post-approval, we can confirm that all of the things that we thought we saw are validated or the drugs can be withdrawn. So in some cases, the FDA and senior officials at the FDA speak out very strongly in favor of the use of this process. But when you get into the bowels of the organization, the bureaucracy, a kind of a conservatism sets in, and the standards, the flexibility that the leaders of the agency are calling for doesn't get applied.
Who are the companies that, in general, create these orphan drugs?
In general, they're created by biotech companies. Many people are aware of big pharma companies, but I'm sure your listeners are aware of how the genetic engineering revolution created biotechnology. Genentech, the first company, to really become a celebrated leader. Genzyme Corporation, the company I had the privilege to work for over 20 years, is widely considered the founder of the Orphan Drug Revolution. Henry Tamir, the longtime president and CEO, is often seen in that light, and I tell that story at length in my book. But Genzyme was acquired now by a French company, Sanofi, and today there's been an explosion of new companies, many of which some of them are well-known mid-sized biotech companies from Vertex and Biogen and Alnylam and BioMarin, but there are hundreds of small biotech companies, many in Boston or in the Bay Area of San Francisco, that are working on many new therapies for many new diseases with new platforms like RNA, gene editing, gene therapy, the genetic therapies that will be the wave of the future.
So can you comment on the economics of orphan drugs? I could only imagine by definition, these drugs aren't prescribed very frequently, if at all, just because, of course, these are for rare, ultra-rare conditions. So what are the economic incentives for these biotech companies to create and expand the role of orphan drugs?
Yeah, that's an important topic to address at length in the book, the incentives and the affordability and the sustainability. The Orphan Drug Act, probably the key provision of the Orphan Drug Act, was providing a period of extended market exclusivity for these drugs, which by the time they come to market, by the time they're approved, are often nearing the end of a patent life. And so the Orphan Drug Act provides a period of 7 years of market exclusivity to allow companies and investors to recoup the cost of their investments. That's been central to the flowering of orphan drugs. But today, there's a lot of pressure. People listen and hear all the time on Capitol Hill about campaigns to cap drug prices or lower drug costs. And what's important for people to understand is what matters to patients and families are the out-of-pocket costs incurred by their insurance policies, their co-pays and their deductibles. No patient pays or should pay the list price of an orphan drug. And so, insurance companies often try to kind of confuse patients by making them think that the price of the drug is the problem, whereas it's the insurance costs that are the problem. Today, because these drugs are so rare, these diseases are so rare, they have not driven up the overall cost of healthcare or even drug spending. But if the incentives are further reduced, today we are in a climate of a kind of a freeze on investment because people are so concerned about lack of adequate reimbursement. If that continues, today, companies are going bankrupt and programs are being terminated, and we're at risk of losing the momentum that's been generated.
All right. So in your book, Inside the Orphan Drug Revolution, just share what are some of the high points that you want readers to come away with?
Well, I think there are a couple. I think the reasons I wrote the book, number one, is to celebrate and tell the stories of people I've been inspired by for 40 years. I'm not a physician or a scientist, but I've had the privilege of working with some of what I think are truly the best and brightest minds of our time, who are incredibly passionate and dedicated, and who work with patients and patient advocates to create miracles. I tell the story of miracles of these different therapies that have been developed against all odds. Their stories deserve to be known. And secondly, for kind of the reason we were just talking about, that, these orphan diseases can strike any family. Sometimes people think genetic diseases, quote, run in families. And if you don't have one in your family, you don't need to worry about it. But as you know, they can strike any family. And if people want to be sure that their children, their grandchildren, their nieces, their nephews have access to these therapies, it's important to maintain the patient advocacy that got the Orphan Drug Act passed in the first place and that is needed to sustain appropriate support for these therapies.
So tell us about the future in terms of what you think the roadmap is for these sometimes smaller biotechnology companies, orphan drugs, and its impact on the larger pharmaceutical industry as a whole.
Well, to your last point, it's had a big impact on the pharmaceutical industry because, much of the innovation has come from these biotech companies and these rare diseases. And so they have transformed the industry. But the future is challenged because increasingly, the diseases that are untreated are these ultra orphan diseases. The economic incentives are very challenging. The economics of one-time therapies are very challenging. Gene therapy offers the promise of a one-time administration with a lifetime of benefit. But if you look at the way reimbursement systems work today, companies will receive far less reimbursement over the life of a patient for a one-time administration than they would for today's standard of chronic, every 2 week, every 4 week IV administration. And so we need to address that. We need to provide incentives for these one-time therapies. I think the bottom line, the way I would answer your question in one way is the future, I think, is very bright with regard to emerging new scientific technologies and our ability to find ways to treat these therapies. It's much cloudier with regard to finding the financial incentives to support investment to allow those developments to proceed.
How are these drugs tested? Typically, drugs are done double-blind, placebo-controlled, but for rare and ultra-rare diseases, sometimes that's difficult to do. So in general, how are these drugs tested to make sure that they are indeed effective?
Yeah, sometimes they are done in those double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials, but sometimes in truly ultra-orphan populations, that's not feasible. And so a typical alternative would be what's called a natural history study, and they have to be done very carefully, where a company identifies untreated patients with this disease, and over a period of many years, typically with the support of academic physicians and the kind of the patient community, puts together a very clear analysis of the path of the disease left untreated, and then by identifying very similar comparable patients to treat, compares their results with the natural history cohort and is able to demonstrate a clear benefit based on that comparison.
And just to give us a sense of the economics, in general, to develop an orphan drug, how much would it cost a biotech company to bring it to market?
Well, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to develop individual drugs because of the cost of research, development, manufacturing, clinical trials, and supporting the infrastructure along the way. What's even more important for people to understand, and again, I discussed this in the book as others have, is that the risk of these programs is so high. We sometimes say 90% of all drugs fail. If you go back to early stages of discovery, I think you could say 98% of all programs fail. 50% of all programs that get into very expensive phase 3 clinical trials fail. And so the programs that are successful, if we want research to be continued, if we want further investment in research and new therapies, the drugs that are successful need to cover not only the cost of developing that drug, but the cost of all the failures that are incurred along the way.
We're talking to Jim Geraghty. He's a healthcare executive, and he's the author of the book, Inside the Orphan Drug Revolution, The Promise of Patient-Centered Biotechnology. Jim, tell us some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience.
Well, Kevin, I would say, first of all, I appreciate this time. I think many of your listeners are probably hearing more and more about these diseases and this movement. It's becoming much better known. And I think for all of them, there are active patient communities worth engaging with. These patient communities are inspiring. I've been inspired by them. They are the ones on the forefront of energizing new research, new clinical trials, movements like newborn screening and early diagnosis. And I encourage those of your listeners who are in the medical community to engage with those groups. I think they'll be inspired by them, and hopefully they can find some way to contribute to the continuing improvement of therapy for them.
Jim, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight, and thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been a pleasure.